When the HOA said absolutely no pools allowed, I was devastated. But then I asked myself, what's the difference between a pool and a pond? And that's when things got interesting. What started as a petty battle over property rights turned into something so much bigger. A story about finding peace in chaos, standing up to rigid systems, and accidentally uniting a neighborhood. I thought I was just digging a hole to cool off in. Turns out, I was digging my way out of something far deeper. Let me take you back to where it all started. We had just moved into the house a few months earlier. My wife and I had been saving for years, scrimping and budgeting, living in a cramped apartment, while dreaming about one day owning a place of our own. When we finally found this house, 3 bedrooms, a big backyard, in a clean, safe neighborhood with good schools, it felt like the American dream. Sure, it came with an HOA, but at the time, I shrugged it off. Everyone we knew who had bought a home recently had to deal with one. I figured it was just paperwork and guidelines about garbage bins and paint colors. I had no idea how much power they actually wielded. It wasn't long before summer rolled around, and the temperature started creeping up into the 90s. I remember standing in the backyard one afternoon, sweat dripping down my back, and turning to my wife to say, "You know what would be amazing right here? A pool." She smiled and nodded, already reading my mind. It had been part of the dream all along. A place for our future kids, weekend barbecues, nights under the stars, maybe even a couple of floaties with cup holders. Nothing massive, just a modest in-ground pool with a little patio space around it. We were finally in a position to make it happen. I started researching local contractors, getting quotes, and drafting sketches. I even created a full 3D model using a design app, so we could visualize what the space would look like. We were giddy. This was it, our backyard oasis. All that was left was submitting the paperwork to the HOA. I wasn't worried. Why would I be? It's my yard. I wasn't building a nightclub or a helicopter pad. The application process was predictably tedious. Forms, fees, diagrams, property boundaries. We sent it all in with fingers crossed and began mentally planning our first pool party. A couple of weeks later, the response arrived. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Kelly," the letter began. That formality already told me it wasn't good news. After reviewing your application for the installation of an in-ground pool, the Architectural Review Committee has denied your request. The proposed structure does not conform to the standards and aesthetic harmony outlined in Section 3, Paragraph B, Subsection 4 of the HOA Covenant. I had to read it 3 times to process it. Denied. No pool. Just like that. I called the HOA office to ask for clarification. I was told the committee believed pools would disrupt the visual uniformity of the neighborhood. I asked how that made sense, given that at least 3 houses on our block had basketball hoops bolted into their driveways, and one house had a 10-foot inflatable Santa still up in May. The answer I got was vague and robotic. Those elements are not considered permanent structures and are not under the same review criteria. I pressed further. Was there any way to appeal? Was this a temporary denial? Could I adjust the plan? The answer, no, no, and no. I was furious. It didn't feel like fairness. It felt personal. Or political. Or just plain lazy. My wife, ever the optimist, tried to comfort me. "Maybe we can just get one of those above-ground ones for now," she offered. But we both knew that wasn't the same. We didn't want a flimsy plastic tub in the yard. We wanted to build something beautiful. Something permanent. And most of all, we wanted the right to make our own choices on our own land. For a few days, I moped around, considering whether it was even worth living in this HOA-controlled neighborhood. I started looking up horror stories. People fined for parking their cars slightly crooked. People banned from hanging flags. Someone even told they couldn't grow tomatoes. The deeper I dug, the more I felt like a prisoner. This wasn't the suburban paradise we'd envisioned. It was a glorified adult daycare with petty rules and self-appointed gatekeepers. But then, something changed. I wasn't ready to give up yet. One evening, as I sat on the patio staring out at the sad, empty yard, I opened my laptop and began searching. Alternatives to backyard pools. The usual suspects came up: jacuzzis, splash pads, outdoor showers. But one thread caught my eye. It was on a home improvement forum. A guy had posted pictures of his natural swimming pond, complete with lily pads, rocks, and koi fish. It looked serene, magical, even, more importantly, it wasn't technically a pool. That's when the idea hit me. I went back to the HOA guidelines and started reading like a lawyer prepping for trial. There was an entire section on pools, dimensions, materials, fencing requirements, noise restrictions. But when I searched the document for the word pond, it appeared exactly once, and it wasn't banned. In fact, it was listed as a non-permanent decorative water feature, lumped in with fountains and bird baths. A loophole. A perfect, glorious loophole. My heart started racing. If I could have a pool, maybe I could have something even better. A pond, deep enough to cool off in, filled with plants and fish instead of chlorine. And if I played my cards right, I could make it every bit as refreshing and 10 times more beautiful. I spent the next week researching everything I could about pond construction. There was an entire subculture I'd never known existed. People who turned their backyards into little pockets of nature, full of ecosystem-based swimming holes that blended into the environment. I took notes, downloaded blueprints, and mapped out every inch of our yard. Then I submitted a new proposal to the HOA. This time, the language was very careful. Ecological water garden. I called it ornamental wildlife habitat. I included diagrams of aquatic plants, rocks, and a cascading waterfall feature. I even threw in a blurb about supporting pollinators and natural biodiversity. The response from the HOA was curt, but telling. Approve with conditions. They clearly didn't take it seriously. Probably figured it was a little decorative pond with goldfish and a few cattails. But I knew what I was building, and it wasn't a pond you toss a penny in. The very next weekend, I got to work. I rented a small backhoe, roped in a couple of buddies who owed me favors, and we started digging. My wife documented everything, part curiosity, part insurance in case the HOA tried to backtrack. We carved out a rounded basin about 20 feet long and 8 feet wide, with varying depths and a deep end nearly 4 feet down. Technically, not a recreational pool by their standards, but cool enough to wade into on a hot day. Once the digging was done, we laid down a heavy-duty liner and installed a powerful filtration system. I added sand and gravel, built a stone border, and started planting water lilies, pickerelweed, submerged oxygenators. A local nursery helped me source some mosquito fish and young koi. Within a few days, the pond started coming to life. Dragonflies buzzed around. Birds landed nearby to drink. And when the sun hit the water just right, the entire surface sparkled like it was made of glass. I couldn't help but smile. Of course, it didn't take long before the HOA noticed. A week into the project, as I was adjusting the pump, I saw Karen. Yes, her name was actually Karen, walking by slowly, clipboard in hand, eyes squinting through oversized sunglasses. She paused, sniffed the air like a bloodhound, and called out, "This looks a lot like a swimming pool." I stood up and waved. No chlorine, no concrete, and it supports native plants. Just a pond. She narrowed her eyes. "We'll be reviewing this." Sure enough, a letter showed up 3 days later. Possible violation of structural guidelines. HOA inspection pending. I replied with my own letter, quoting their own rules back to them, section and paragraph, with annotated photos of the pond. I labeled every plant, cited wetland support studies. I even included a note from the local nursery verifying that the pond was intended for non-recreational, ecological purposes. The inspection came and went. They couldn't find a single clause to use against me. Karen was not pleased. But something unexpected happened that week. A neighbor from 2 houses down came over and said, "I've been watching this thing come together. It's beautiful. Reminds me of my grandfather's farm pond." Another neighbor, a retired teacher, dropped off a stack of old magazines about native plants. Kids started peeking through the fence, asking if they could see the fish. I invited them in, carefully, one group at a time. It wasn't just a pond anymore. It was becoming something else. Still, I wasn't celebrating just yet. The HOA was quiet, for now, but I knew that silence could mean anything. I kept documenting, kept improving the landscaping, and waited. Little did I know, the real story was just beginning. By the time the water settled in the pond and the koi had begun circling lazily beneath the lily pads, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I had found the loophole. I had outmaneuvered the HOA by staying strictly within the lines of their precious guidelines. The pond wasn't a pool. It wasn't for recreational purposes. It was an ecological water garden, just as described in their own covenants. But what I underestimated was how much pride the HOA, specifically Karen, took in having the final say. The first sign of trouble came not with a letter, but with a car. A dull silver SUV that had HOA Patrol stenciled in small, authoritative letters on the side began driving past my house 3 or 4 times a day. I'd never noticed them before, but now they circled the block like sharks. Sometimes they'd slow to a crawl, one of them leaning slightly toward the window, probably snapping pictures. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself they'd get bored and move on, but they didn't. A week after the final inspection, I received another letter. This one was worded more carefully, almost cautious in tone. Dear Mr. Kelly, it has come to the attention of the HOA board that the recent installation in your backyard, while technically compliant, may constitute a structure designed for regular recreational use. This is currently under review by the Architectural Committee. I read that sentence over and over again. May constitute. That was their angle now. They weren't arguing that it was illegal. They were arguing it was against the spirit of the rules. And that's when I realized this wasn't about aesthetics or harmony or fish. It was about control. They didn't want to admit they'd been outmaneuvered. And they certainly didn't want a precedent where someone like me, just a homeowner with a shovel, could stand up to their authority and win. But I was done backing down. If they wanted to review my pond, I'd give them something worth reviewing. I doubled down. I added solar-powered lights around the stone perimeter, subtle and warm, casting a golden hue over the water at night. I planted native grasses and irises around the edges, creating a soft, natural barrier. Then, I installed a small arched wooden bridge across the narrowest section, not for function, just for charm. My wife painted a wooden sign that said, "The Kelly Garden," and we posted it near the gate. It wasn't grand or defiant. It was beautiful, peaceful, and clearly not a pool. To be clear, I never intended for it to become a public spectacle. But when you're the guy who stood up to the HOA and created a pond that looked like it belonged in a magazine, word travels fast. That's when the neighbors started showing up, not in protest, but in admiration. First, it was the older couple next door, the Harrises. Mr. Harris shuffled over one evening while I was skimming leaves from the surface and said, "I had a pond once, back before all these rules." Brings back memories. He told me stories about raising catfish on his dad's property and how he used to sneak out at night just to listen to frogs. I offered him a seat on one of the new benches we'd installed. He sat down with a sigh, like it had been decades since he relaxed. Then came the Smiths, a young couple with 2 curious toddlers who'd been watching the fish from behind their fence. I invited them over, set up a little safety railing near the edge, and let the kids drop food pellets into the water. Their faces lit up in a way no HOA memo could ever understand. That moment, it struck me that this whole thing had become more than a workaround. It had become a gathering place, a center, a reason for people to look up from their phones and wave across the fence line. But of course, not everyone was pleased. A week after the lights went up, Karen returned. She didn't knock. She didn't smile. She stood just outside the gate with a folded manila envelope and a forced calm in her voice. "Mr. Kelly," she began, "I'm here on behalf of the board. We've had some concerns raised." I invited her in, gesturing toward the pond like a maitre d' in a fancy restaurant. "You should see it at sunset," I said. She did not smile. She handed me the envelope. Inside were photos, overhead shots, street views, even one taken through a knothole in our fence, each labeled with pen, detailing measurements, light placement, and water features. Karen cleared her throat. While the structure technically falls within the definition of a water feature, the board believes it is being used as a recreational pool. I held up one of the photos. "Used? You mean the one where my neighbor's grandson is feeding fish with me? Is that recreational?" She ignored the sarcasm. The board is considering issuing a cease and desist, unless you voluntarily reduce the scope of the structure. Reduce? I asked. Reduce what exactly? The water? The fish? She didn't answer. She simply nodded and walked off. I stood there watching her SUV pull away, the koi swimming behind me in quiet circles, and realized this was never going to stop unless I made it stop. So I did something that probably shocked even my wife. I invited the HOA to a pond party. Not a pool party. A pond party. The flyer said, Community Eco Day at the Kelly Garden. Learn about native species, enjoy herbal tea, and meet your neighbors. I handed out invites, posted them to our little Facebook community group, and even put one on Karen's mailbox. I knew it was bold, maybe reckless, but I was done being passive. The day of the event, I cleaned every stone. The water was crystal clear. We had tea, lemonade, folding chairs, a table of brochures about native aquatic plants. My wife even played soft music from a Bluetooth speaker hidden under the bench, and people came. Not just a few curious neighbors, but nearly 30 residents from up and down the street. Some brought folding chairs. Some brought kids. A retired schoolteacher gave an impromptu talk about water ecosystems. Even Mr. Harris brought a photo album of his old backyard pond. It turned into a real event. No swimming, no shouting, just people together. Karen showed up late. She stood across the yard like a sentry, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. I offered her a cup of tea. She declined. I asked if she wanted a brochure. She said, I think I've seen enough. She left without another word. The next HOA letter that arrived wasn't a cease and desist. It was a notice of a special board meeting to review the current guidelines for outdoor water features. I could read between the lines. They were trying to find a new way to shut this down, tighten the language, close the loophole, reassert their control. But by then, the tide had shifted. The community had seen the pond. They'd sat by it, heard the water run, fed the fish. It wasn't some act of rebellion anymore. It was a neighborhood feature. When the meeting date came, I showed up. So did Mr. Harris. So did nearly a dozen other residents. Some brought notes. Others brought stories. One young mom stood up and said, My kid has sensory issues. He won't sit still for anything, but he'll sit by that pond for hours. That space has done more for our family than the HOA ever has. There wasn't much the board could do at that point. They couldn't ban ponds outright without alienating half the community. They couldn't retroactively declare my installation a pool. It would never hold up legally. They tabled the review and moved on to mailbox height uniformity. After the meeting, Karen stepped down from the board. Mr. Harris ran for her seat the next month. He won by a landslide. With her gone, the hostility evaporated. People stopped peeking nervously through fences. A few even asked if I'd help them design something similar in their own yards. I wasn't a contractor, but I offered advice, shared my plans, and gave away extra plants that had taken root in the margins. It was strange. I never set out to be a community leader. I just wanted a place to cool off. But in the process of finding a loophole, I found a way to bring people together. My wife and I added a small bench swing beneath the oak tree next to the pond. Some evenings we'd sit there in silence, just listening to the water, the frogs, the quiet hum of life returning to a suburban yard. It didn't matter anymore that it wasn't a pool. The pond had become something more. It had become a mirror, showing us what kind of community we really wanted to live in. Sometimes you fight the system. Sometimes you work around it. But every now and then, you do both. And in doing so, you remind everyone around you that rules only matter if they serve the people, not the other way around. And it all started with a simple question. What if I just dig a pond? The months that followed brought an unexpected kind of calm. With Karen no longer on the HOA board and Mr. Harris stepping in, the tone of the community shifted almost overnight. It wasn't that the rules disappeared. Far from it. The HOA still sent out its newsletters, still reminded folks to keep their lawns trimmed and trash bins tucked away. But the air of intimidation was gone. The sense that a small group of self-appointed enforcers could dictate the soul of the neighborhood had begun to erode. And at the center of that change, somehow, was my pond. The pond itself took on a life of its own. What started as a workaround had become a feature, a focal point for the neighborhood. Every Saturday afternoon, we left the gate open. People started to wander in, some regulars, some new faces. There wasn't a formal invite anymore, just an unspoken understanding that this quiet little sanctuary was for everyone. Kids would come to feed the koi. Parents would sit under the oak tree with a cup of iced tea. Older neighbors who barely spoke before would show up with cuttings from their gardens, offering them to plant near the edges of the water. What had once been just my backyard was now, in a small but meaningful way, ours. I installed a small little free library at the edge of the fence line. Nothing fancy, just a weatherproof wooden box with a glass door and a hand-painted sign that said, "Take a book, leave a book." Within days, it was full. Someone added a bench next to it, left anonymously. Another person dropped off a set of solar lanterns with a note that read, "For the garden nights." I mounted them discreetly around the pond. Every addition was small, subtle, but together, they built something that felt sacred, almost fragile, an unspoken agreement that we were all contributing to something good. Of course, the HOA board still held meetings, and I still attended. But now, I wasn't the only voice questioning decisions. More residents started speaking up, asking why we couldn't have more community gardens, why solar panels were discouraged, why simple additions like trellises required 3 signatures and a fee. People had realized they weren't powerless. All it took was one person to bend a rule with purpose and transparency, and suddenly, everyone else remembered they had a voice too. Ironically, I never even used the pond the way I originally intended. I had dreamed of slipping into cool water on hot days, floating lazily under the sun. But I never swam in it. Not once. I could have. Technically, there was no law against it, but it never felt right. It had become too much a shared space. Too meaningful. Besides, what I got from the pond was something deeper than physical refreshment. It brought me peace in a way that no swimming pool ever could. One evening in early fall, just as the leaves began to turn, I noticed someone new standing by the edge of the pond. He was in his early 30s, dressed in work clothes and holding a cup of coffee. I walked over and introduced myself. His name was Daniel. He and his wife had just moved into the house 2 doors down. "This is beautiful," he said, gesturing to the water. I thought it was just some kind of elaborate fish tank at first, but it's more like a park. I smiled. "Thanks. It wasn't exactly planned that way." He sipped his coffee. "Is it true you built this because the HOA wouldn't let you have a pool?" "Something like that." He nodded, thinking for a moment. "You know, that's kind of genius." We stood in silence for a while, watching the koi swirl beneath the surface, the plants shifting gently in the evening breeze. Then he said something that stuck with me. "It's funny. They told us when we moved here that the HOA kept the neighborhood clean and functional. But this," he waved his hand around, "this is the only place around here that feels alive." That comment stayed with me for weeks. I'd never thought about it in those terms before, but he was right. The rules had created a neighborhood that was tidy and uniform, but sterile. It was a kind of place where everything looked perfect from the curb but felt disconnected once you stepped past the front door. The pond, in its quiet defiance, had become a counterpoint, a reminder that beauty and life don't always come from order. They come from freedom, creativity, and the courage to build something different. Winter arrived slowly. The koi went dormant, settling near the bottom where the water stayed warmest. The plants thinned out. The lights came on earlier, but people still came. The Saturdays continued, though now they were quieter, more reflective. We served hot cider instead of lemonade. Mr. Harris, who had become something of a fixture, started bringing an old portable heater that he claimed had survived 3 hurricanes and a flood. No one questioned it. During the HOA's end-of-year meeting, they held elections again. Mr. Harris retained his seat. Another spot opened up, and to everyone's surprise, including his own, Daniel was nominated and won. I could see it happening in real time. The board was becoming more representative, less about enforcing control, more about guiding the community. The pond hadn't just changed the rules. It had changed the people. One of the last big moments came on a cold Saturday afternoon in December. Someone, I never found out who, decorated the trees around the pond with string lights. They weren't flashy or synchronized with music, just simple white bulbs. Another neighbor brought over a portable speaker playing soft jazz and classic holiday songs. We ended up with about 30 people that day, huddled in coats and gloves, sipping cocoa and sharing cookies. It wasn't a planned event. There were no signs or invitations, but it was one of the warmest, most genuine gatherings I'd ever experienced. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stood by the pond, bundled in my jacket, watching the lights shimmer on the surface of the water. The koi were hidden, buried deep in the sediment and stillness of the season, but I knew they were there, waiting, resting, preparing for spring. My wife came out and stood beside me. "You remember when you were ready to tear this yard up and move out?" she asked. I laughed, vividly. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "You did good." For a long time, we stood there in silence. Then I asked her, half jokingly, "Do you think they'll put the pond in the HOA brochure now?" She chuckled. "Only if they rename it, the reason we had to rewrite the bylaws." It's been a year now since that first rejection letter. The pond has survived 4 seasons, a small political shakeup, and more than a few skeptical glances. It's weathered storms, shed leaves, and bloomed anew. And in that time, I've learned more about patience, community, and quiet resistance than I ever imagined possible. Sometimes people stop me in the neighborhood. They'll say something like, "You know, I thought that pond was going to be a mess, but it turned out amazing." I usually just smile and say thanks. But occasionally, if they seem genuinely curious, I'll tell them the full story. I'll explain how the rules were never the real problem. It was the interpretation of them. How power, when left unchecked, tends to calcify into stubbornness, and how creativity, when applied thoughtfully, can be more powerful than outright rebellion. The pond didn't break any laws. It didn't violate any code. It simply asked a better question: what else is possible? I like to think that's the real legacy of what I built. Not the water or the plants or the fish, but the space it created for better questions, for softer conversations, for neighbors to sit beside one another and be still and listen and share. To this day, I haven't swum in the pond, and I probably never will. It's not because I can't. It's because what the pond gave me in return is worth so much more than what I originally wanted. And so I leave you with this. We all face rules, restrictions, systems that seem set in stone. Sometimes they make sense. Sometimes they don't. But in every case, we have a choice: to fight blindly, to comply without question, or to find a crack in the wall and plant something beautiful inside it. So I ask you, what would you build if you stopped waiting for permission? Thanks for being here. And if stories like this inspire you about community, creativity, and standing your ground, don't forget to subscribe for more. Because sometimes the best way to challenge the rules isn't to break them, it's to build a pond instead.